The lived experience is that bills are quite high, right? The affordability of energy is just not there, and it hasn't been.
You're absolutely right. Energy bills are too high. They're too high right now. We are 100% aware of that. That's why in the budget, obviously, we did this £150 off energy costs. Plus, we've done the warm homes discount. So an extra £150 to 6 million people across the UK. So that's short term, but we need to bring those prices down. Also for families, but also for businesses. So for most reasons, and actually I think some of the framing around abundant energy and fabulous, that's what we all want in the long term, cheap abundant energy. So how do we do that? And as you say, how do we explain that a lot of the vast reason is because of the exposure to the fossil fuel market?
Hello, I'm Bryony Worthington, and this is Cleaning Up. My guest this week is Katie Wright MP and Climate Minister in the UK government. Katie and I met over 20 years ago when we worked at Friends of the Earth on the campaign for the Climate Change Act. And here she is now as the Minister responsible for carbon budgets and net zero alongside other climate priorities. It was only 12 months after she was elected as an MP for Leeds North West that she was made a climate minister and what she's described as her dream job. So I'm delighted to be joining her here in London to discuss her new role, what she's excited about, and the current challenges that she's facing. Please join me in welcoming Katie Wright to Cleaning Up. Katie, it's so lovely to be with you today, and thank you for coming on Cleaning Up. I'm going to start in the traditional way, which is to ask you to introduce yourself in your own words, please.
My name is Katie Wright. I am the Minister for Climate in the Department for Security, Energy Net Zero, based here in the UK. I'm also the Member of Parliament for Leeds North West.
And how recently were you appointed Minister? It's quite new, isn't it?
It is quite new. You've caught me out a little bit on the days, because if you came in, we actually had some blooms because I had 100 days just before Christmas. So it was in September. So just about one quarter we've done. But yeah, we had our 100 days just before Christmas. So we're just planning our next 100 days at the moment. So relatively new.
But we should obviously explain to our listeners that we know each other and work together at Friends of the Earth on the Climate Change Act. And now here you are as the Minister responsible for that act, essentially, for the carbon budgets and for the net zero targets. So how does that feel?
Pretty amazing, actually. Pretty amazing. Like in terms of, obviously, it's not something I imagined at that time. It was a pretty amazing time that we had, which is obviously was about 2003 we started to work together. So we've been working, it's like 22 years we've known each other.
Yes, so exactly. I know, that's just
obviously
terrifying.
We don't look like that at all. No, but in terms of, it wasn't something I envisaged at the time. I don't think we even had a climate minister at the time.
Probably not.
So
actually,
I don't think we even had a climate minister
Margaret
at the
Beckett
time.
And then David Miliband looking after DEFRA, right? That was where
and it was
sat.
there, and the energy was in DTI.
That's right.
Do you remember?
Yeah,
So it was a whole different ballgame. So the fact that there is actually even a minister for climate, and the fact that carbon budgets, we are heading into setting carbon budget 7, is pretty crazy, because carbon budget was your idea. I mean, in terms of, I remember you coming and it was your idea. You came up with it. I think you wrote it one late night.
Probably.
Came in, we got an idea, but obviously, I was leading on a lot of the campaign here, and that's actually where I ended up meeting the now Secretary of State. Yeah. So it is a bit of a circle of life. But yeah, it's fantastic. It's an amazing place to be. I also feel really fortunate to be with the Secretary of State, who is second time round, knows exactly what he's doing, hit the ground running, with a huge amount of energy.
Yes. Well, it's really interesting to think back through. I mean, the fact that we thought that we were trying to build something that had enduring kind of qualities, didn't we? We were basically the campaign was based around the fact that there was just no long-term plan, right? Emissions were bouncing around. Government didn't seem to have a whole government approach. So bringing in the carbon budgets was a way of trying to force a little bit more long-term thinking. And has that actually worked? Do you think? Do you see evidence of that?
Absolutely. I think what really sort of surprised me, and obviously I've been in and around this sector for a long time, but I've sort of come in and out in different ways with children, etc. But in terms of coming in and looking at what's happened in the last 10 20 years, but certainly in the last 10 years, is quite phenomenal. Like, I don't think we certainly didn't expect the price of solar to drop like it dropped. Yeah. We didn't probably expect the deployment of wind to be as it is. So some things are not going in the right direction, but there's a lot of things that are going in the right direction. And I think one of the key messages I try and convey is actually Britain's been doing a really good job. Now, we've loads more to do, and I'm not in any way complacent, but we should be really proud of what has happened. And I think that is in large part down to the Climate Change Act and to the political consensus that we've had in the UK. But it set the system heading in the right direction, and it set the framework and then allowed the creativity to come forward. As you said, we didn't think what was the short-term problem. It was like, what was the underlying problem? And the underlying problem, as you remember, was DEFRA was almost going around government with a begging bowl going, please, sir, throw us some emissions cuts. Do you know what I mean? And it was awful.
Yeah, it was.
And nobody was going to bother doing that. And it wasn't on their priority list. But flipping it around and going, this is what the science says. And therefore, within that context, this is what we need to do. Actually, we've got an incredible bunch of civil servants who can deliver, but need that strategic direction.
Yeah. And it feels to me it was really important in the early years to set that, because the economics weren't quite on our side, right? That, you know, you can remember we had these fights with the Treasury about, well, why would we why would we create this harm to ourselves? But fast forward to today, and you know, those early actions mean that we are less exposed to some of the vulnerabilities of being exposed to big, high volatility in fossil fuels, because we've managed to exploit that offshore wind resource relatively quickly. And I feel like Climate Change Act kind of, perhaps people sometimes think it's very prescriptive about what we do, but it wasn't. It was just, this is the framework, and within that, do the most sensible things that play to our strengths, right? And as you say, we've done that really well.
Absolutely. And when we were looking 20 years back, I remember, I'm sure you do, that the CBI supported the Climate Change Act. And it was Digby Jones.
Yeah, Digby Jones back then.
Quite a character who supported. And I think for having that breadth of coalition with Friends of the Earth, some people, to Digby Jones. But Digby Jones wanted nuclear. And so for him, because it was technology neutral, because we weren't prescriptive, because we were just saying, actually, let's base ourselves in science. That's all we agree. And then let's argue about the policy. Then absolutely. And as you say, we've had so many benefits, whether it's just around offshore wind, whether it's around green finance in the city, which is, been a huge market, and whether it's as contributing across the world, it has been really beneficial.
But here we are now kind of facing into probably its most turbulent times, right? In the sense that I think there's only 3 MPs who voted against the bill, right, when it went through, thanks in large part to your work going around the country with all these constituency meetings and getting getting Conservatives on board. And I mean, there was a solid consensus. But right now, that's not where we are, is it? I mean, we've got that fracturing of people kind of seeming to blame the work we're doing on climate for a lot of other ills. So how is that feeling at the moment, like, when you're in and about Parliament?
So look, obviously the political consensus is not where it was before. And whereas you talked about when we had the 412 MPs that supported us going through the House, it's not there. I don't think it's totally broken. I think it's sort of slightly fractured. I don't feel comfortable with that at all. I'm trying to understand, and I'm trying to work with, and I'm trying to address concerns, because I don't think being entirely rigid all the time is the right approach anyway. And I want to work with people. So I've very much been trying to work behind the scenes and reaching out to think about how we can build consensus and how we can work together, because ultimately, for me, we have the privilege of being in government, and I hope for many terms to come. But it's likely that governments will change. This is bigger than all of us. And as we've just said, Britain has benefited from having that cross-party consensus. I care more about the country and about our next generations than anything else. And so for me, it's around how can we make sure Britain has the competitive advantage and we set ourselves up for the challenges ahead. Yeah. So it feels uncomfortable in terms of, clearly people are calling it out, but I'm trying to listen to. The thing I do take comfort from is a couple of things. One is the polling is still pretty incredible. In terms of the numbers of people that support tackling action on climate change in the UK is way up. I think it's about 69% of people are supporting action or want more action on climate change. Now, any political party would bite your hand off for those sort of numbers, in terms of the numbers are incredibly high. The other thing is business, the deployment and investment that is going on. The green economy is growing 3 times as fast in the UK than the rest of the economy. But also, you'll have seen numbers in China, but across the world, global deployment figures are incredible. The green economy is moving at such a pace. So in a way, I just feel frustrated sort of frustrated in the sense that I don't want Britain to lose any opportunities.
Yeah, as you say, you're listening to people. I think what's difficult for people is that the lived experience is that bills are quite high, right? The affordability of energy is just not there, and it hasn't been. I mean, so, and actually, we could track it back. There's lots of reasons, some of which is out of our control. Russia invades Ukraine, gas prices go crazy. We're exposed to gas import prices because of our own gas reserves that are drawing down. But then there is the reality that we've added a lot of kind of, subsidies or price guarantees to get those investments in from the sector, just to provide, there's been intervention in the market, hasn't there, that's added to costs. And now we've also got an aging grid. A lot of our power stations were old because we're very, quite an old economy, mature economy. So it's all kind of piling up. So it feels like there's a narrative war of, it's easy to weaponize it and say it's all the green stuff. And there's a little bit of truth in that, but it's not the whole picture. And how do we, in a world of, attention spans that are shrinking, it feels as if this narrative is actually the crucial thing now. How do you people can be in an abstract sense supportive of climate, but then when it comes to their own homes, being very resistant.
You're absolutely right. And I guess that the challenge and the opportunity around climate change is that it affects so many bits of our lives, and the answers to it are so many bits of our lives that you might support the headline, but actually which elements of that does it mean, and how does it fit with you? Look, you say about energy bills, you're absolutely right. Energy bills are too high. They're too high right now. We are 100% aware of that. That's why in the budget, obviously, we did this £150 off energy costs. Plus, we've done the warm homes discount, so an extra £150 to 6 million people across the UK. So that's short term, but we need to bring those prices down, also for families, but also for businesses. So for most reasons, and actually I think some of the framing around abundant energy and fabulous, that's what we all want in the long term, cheap abundant energy. So how do we do that? And as you say, how do we explain that a lot of the vast reason is because of the exposure to the fossil fuel market. So that exposure to the fossil fuel market has been the biggest problem. We have made some investments, and as you say, we need more investment, which is something that is easily ignored often by the opposition, because they'll say, and I kind of think, well, look, you've got 3 options here in terms of we either leave the energy system as it is, in which case it's decaying and we won't take advantage of opportunities, we won't keep up to date. We invest in a fossil fuel system, or we upgrade to a clean energy system. Those are the sort of 3 options. We need to do that whilst at the same time bring prices down. So I think we are very conscious, and certainly that, I would say, occupies the vast majority of Secretary of State's headspace in terms of how do you do both at once. And in the long term, we know that energy prices will come down, because we will, as we've discussed before, this is not, we're shifting from a system that was effectively, a commodity base. So you're renting. It's almost like we've been renting a house, and now we're buying a house, but we're paying the mortgage. And so it's a different system, but we've got to explain that. But ultimately, the sun will be free and the wind is free, as opposed to being, stuck on a commodity-based system with gas and oil, etc. So it will be a better system in the long term, but in that short term, we do have to make sure that we can support people in order that they can see that direction of travel. So I think, as you say, it's around what is that direction of travel? How do we smooth in the short term, which is why we've taken more costs into general taxation. But how do we explain that long term this is going to be good for energy bills, for Britain in terms of future industries, and also for jobs?
So that, I completely agree. And that analogy of renting versus a mortgage is a really good one. But where in government is there an active effort, apart from you telling me on a podcast, to get that out so that you can communicate the big strategy? And just building on what you said, I love that 3 pillars analogy. There are only 3 options, you're absolutely right. But within those pillars, there's a lot of latitude, right? So under the name of clean energy, you could spend, as I would say wrongly Europe has done, spending all your time talking about hydrogen because you've got this idea that you can reuse all your gas infrastructure, which you really can't. And in it, somehow we keep the fuel economy based system going. Whereas what you described, which is this mortgage versus renting, is really a shift to electrification. And yet, I haven't seen a kind of electrification strategy come out of government. I haven't seen a kind of really leaning into that as the obvious. Most paths to net zero go through electricity now. And it leans into our strengths. We've got a great grid. We've got great ways of making clean electrons. So when are we going to see that electrification strategy? Because that is the big thing. You could spend a lot of money pursuing niche, expensive pet projects, and that will add to costs. And I don't think it can be really justified.
So look, I think what you would say, agree with me, I think, but tell me if you don't, that since Secretary of State came in, things have changed radically and we've hit the ground running in terms of pulling back on offshore wind, do you know what I mean? Deploying solar, GB energy, nuclear, etc.
You mean bringing onshore wind back?
Bringing onshore wind back, sorry. So it's because there was a ban, wasn't there, before?
Exactly.
So I think, I guess the way you framed it, for sure we need to electrify a lot of our economy. It hasn't been deployed in that way, but we have a lot of the inputs that we are doing, whether it's around nuclear, whether it's around, our renewables will lead to that, whether it's around electric vehicles and the amount of money that we've been doing to support electric vehicle take up and will need to do. So I think it's an interesting challenge. Yeah. It's what I'll take up for sure. But I think you're right in terms of there is, as I said right at the start, Ed is a mission in himself, do you know what I mean? And has driven this mission, which has been brilliant. So I think he has really articulated, and it's always, excuse the pun, but he has so much energy to do that. Yeah. But I think, so we have moved through that. I think right now we need to look again, and we've got Carbon Budget 7 coming up, and how that explains the story better. But, we're in a pretty crazy and volatile time right now. Things are changing rapidly.
It's complex, but I think the Michael, my co-host Michael Lee, he wrote a really good couple of essays last year about the pragmatic reset. And the thing, my takeaway from that, I didn't agree with all of it, but I thought the important bit was, don't try and do everything all at once. There is a sequence here to how you can get big reductions in the economy through known and affordable options. And I'd be really interested in, how does DESNZ relate to DFT, for example? Because you mentioned, Department for Transport, the biggest source of emissions now for your net zero targets is transport. And actually, I've been really encouraged that the government's held the line on we are making this shift. We are moving to electric transport. Clearer than has been the case in Europe, and certainly embracing of international trade in a way that the US is definitely not doing. So how robust is that transport policy? How much of you, as a climate minister, can you get that kind of cross-departmental sort of collaboration going?
There's a lot there, isn't there? So I heard you say cross-departmental, I heard you say around focus, but then I guess there's on the sort of a whole holistic piece as well. Look, so I think the carbon budgets are really good at looking across and in the detail. And, the officials do an incredible job here, working with officials across government, looking at every single policy and what the, carbon ton saved as is right. At the same time, as a politician, I fundamentally can't hold or argue for 200 different policies at once. So I think you're right. We need to focus on where are the sort of key areas of movement. Obviously, moving towards electrifying the transport sector is a key area moving forward. We've got a really good relationship with DFT. We're working really closely with them on that. And at the same time, it comes up in Parliament. I had a question yesterday on it in terms of how are we supporting electric vehicle charging. So, it's always these changes that we push from here, and then there's friction points, isn't there, at the deployment levels of, are you supporting mayors or are you supporting councils, or where are the blockages and how do you make sure you're moving that? So it's thinking about it in that whole sense. Look, I'm still relatively new. I'm looking in the next bit of how to work more closely. I was with colleagues yesterday across the road, and I'll be meeting with colleagues. I really want to work across government. I think there's much more opportunities to do things much more holistically anyway. Could government be set up better? Yeah, sure. Yeah. But, I think as well as that, there's a lot of that about drive and opportunity and seeing those opportunities for how to have win-wins.
Yeah. And I guess, it comes back to this narrative, doesn't it? The mainstream media, parts of it at least, would love to tell you that electric vehicles are a fad or that they don't work or they're awful. But actually it's for lived experiences for most people now. They really do. Outside of the urban centres maybe and very rural, you've got a lot of aspirational market towns who can see that this is just a better way of doing things. It's a nicer experience. I hope the city's air is clearing out because we've had this awful kind of diesel blight for decades. So it looks like diesel's out and electric's in. But we've got to kind of tell that story, haven't we, in a way that celebrates that. A lot of, I think, we came from Friends of the Earth, where it was cars are evil, you've all got to bicycle everywhere. It just doesn't chime with the British public's lived experience. So if we can lean in to show that electricity is an enabler of a better life, then I think that's you've got a lot of great potential there to keep people's hearts engaged, not just their mind.
Totally. And I'm a bit of a car lover on the side, which is obviously a bit of a weird thing for a climate person, but I do drive electric. And as you say, it's much more fun. Yeah. It is much more fun, as well as so it's generally a better experience. But I think it's also making sure that in some areas where we haven't got the right EV charging, because you just need one person with a bad experience. It's a bit like customer service, isn't it? Then the one person who moans gets heard rather than the other 50 who had a great time don't bother to say, actually, it was all fine for me. So I think you're right. It's how to genuinely address those concerns, but also raise up the voices of people who are having a good experience.
Yeah. Before we go on, I'd love to talk a little bit about international, because I know you've got quite a solid brief on international. Before we do that, though, can we talk about methane? It's a very super pollutants. Let's talk about that, because it's part of your brief. And again, it's another test of whether government can do cross-departmental working well, because the methane emissions, some of it's from energy for sure, but a bulk of it's coming out of agriculture, right, and sort of land use. So how are you dealing with that? There are some technical questions we could get into around how we used to, we had a subsidy for energy from waste, because obviously landfill emits methane. We had these great renewable obligation subsidies that were meaning we were capturing the methane, but that could be phasing out. And it's a real kind of technical detail. And as you say, you can't keep all 200 in your head, but it does test, doesn't it, this question of, departmental cross collaboration when especially with something like that, methane, which is so cross-cutting.
Yeah, and I think, obviously we talked a bit about DFT before. DEFRA is obviously another natural ally but partner in this, because they have so many of the levers. As we talked about before, half of this department came from DEFRA, half came from DTI. And so, a lot as well, whether it's around nature restoration, but also methane being one of the key areas. So, and we've been doing, when we go on to international, we've been doing a lot more on international collaboration. I'm trying to find a better analogy for the short-term break, which I got of reducing methane. There is around the gas flaring piece, that is an area where it's an obvious win. It's an obvious win.
But interestingly, though, it comes from a tension where, there was a perception that if you flare the gas, it's bad for birds. There's these weird tensions where we've kind of gone too far to the green side. This is, coming back to a more pragmatic is, I think, about seeing where the trade-offs are and trying to not be so pure that you damage the good, So, yeah.
I think you're right. I think it was probably you who said to me, everything we do has an environmental impact. And therefore, you need to be aware, go in with that. And therefore, where do you minimise your environmental impact?
Yeah, there's no such thing as a perfect energy system.
No. So you're right. And look, there's also, there's a lot of energy from waste and lots of interesting examples overseas where people have done really interesting, creative ways of managing waste into energy systems. Also, as you say, agriculture, look, agriculture is a tricky sector. It's a tricky sector in terms of, generally agriculture is under a lot of pressure from various different sources. It's been, and food security is an issue at the same time. So I think we need to work on where those technical solutions are. Yeah. And actually,
and also who's got agency, right?
Yeah.
When I looked into this a little bit more, the sort of basic realization I had was that farmers are kind of a conduit between the agrochemical industry and the seed industry who sell them the inputs, and then the supermarkets who basically take the outputs. And they get squeezed between these two powerful forces. And in a way, putting all of climate onto farmers is probably not sensible. If you can work with the input providers and you can work with the supermarkets or the retailers who are buying the product, create the right incentives there, you can leave the farmers alone a little bit. And I feel like that's possibly what we need to do next, is broaden our perception of it. It can't all sit on, a subset of people who are quite isolated and they don't have many of the levers. I'd love to see the supermarkets getting involved in methane, for example, because I suspect they'd work out how to do it and create the right incentives.
I like it. Oh, I'll mention that to the supermarket. So, but I think you're right to think how do people feel? Because actually, I was at the Great Yorkshire Show and talking to farmers about this, and the reason I like talking to farmers is they've also got really good ideas. So, but at the same time, doesn't mean to say that just because you're the one with the ideas, you should have all of the burden on delivery, and how do other people support that? So I think it's also around how people feel within the system. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes saying, we want your solutions may have sounded like you are the problem. And actually, I don't think that is the case. Like, we need to, the role of land is going to be so important, whether we use it for climate, nature, food, energy, house building. It is really important. I'm actually very interested, I think, around, we're doing this energy spatial plan, we're doing a land use framework around how we bring all those elements together. And farmers are one of the key custodians. So how we work with farmers to secure food security, which is an issue in a changing climate, whilst at the same time having the necessary space for, nature, adaptation, etc., is going to be a challenge. Yeah. But they need to be at the centre of that.
Cleaning Up is supported by its leadership circle. The members are Actis, Alcasa Energy, Arup, Signum Capital, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP, Euroelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. If you're enjoying Cleaning Up, please hit like, leave a comment, and also recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and absolutely everyone. To browse our archive of over 200 past episodes and subscribe to our free newsletter, visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live.
Let's move on to international then, because that is part of your brief. Yeah. And it's a pretty big brief. And didn't you, in the very early days of your ministerial appointment, didn't you meet the Energy Secretary of the US, Mr. Chris Wright, or as Michael likes to call him, Chris Wrong?
I did. So I think it was week one, and I took a call from my private secretary saying Patrick Vallance was due to attend the International Energy Agency conference, but had to stay for a select committee, and could I attend in his place? It wasn't the call I was expecting, but actually it was a brilliant opportunity to do more of a deep dive into the international energy space. It was a really interesting, thought-provoking day. I did meet with Chris. We got on really well. I think it was the same week that we'd announced the nuclear collaboration, and I'm sure you're very pleased, but, this government is really doubling down. And what I certainly learned from working with the nuclear civil servants here, we've got some brilliant policy officials here who, and across government, not just in DESNOs, but FCDO and across the team, we've got some real expertise, like genuinely like comparative advantage. This is an area where Britain can lead. And that's something I'm really interested in. Like I keep trying to figure out exactly where all our leading positions are, because ultimately this is a bit of a race and I want us to lead on elements of the low carbon transition. I want Britain to figure out where we can lead and double down on that leadership. And nuclear is clearly an area where we can lead. We have skill set that the Americans don't have. That's why they want to work with us. And yet, of course, look, clearly there's areas where we probably wouldn't agree, but I took it as an opportunity to just look at where did we agree and how could we double down on that? Because actually that is a really powerful collaboration. And I know you've been a big advocate on nuclear for a long time, but it is frustrating how far behind we are and how it could have helped us in this challenge. And if we can expedite that, if we can bring forward some of the SMRs more quickly, not only is that good for climate, good for energy security, could be good for Britain's economy as well.
With the nuclear now kind of semi-renaissance, let's see. I mean, there's still a lot of unknowns. But we did just have in the UK this excellent review, the Fingleton Review, how British is that, which looked at, are we regulating this industry appropriately now for this era? And I think there was a period where, understandably, post-Chernobyl, Fukushima, that, regulation got so overwhelming that I think it's part of why the cost base is so high, for the actual capital build. So is that something that you think, that again, if the UK can lead on that kind of pragmatic, let's regulate this safely, but let's not overdo it so that we kill it by, 1,000 cuts. Is that something you think that is it in your bucket of things the UK can lead on?
Absolutely. And we're really lucky that we've got Patrick Vallance. I mean, he's a rock star anyway, of COVID fame in the UK, but in terms of he is very clear thinking, innovative, thoughtful leader. And so he's working really closely. He's our nuclear minister, but I feel, I know that he's going to drive this forward and is working closely to do that. And he's very pragmatic and comes with a commercial head as well, which I think is where we need to do that. We shouldn't be afraid of doing that. In the same way, I think where you and I have aligned quite a lot is that we're practical greenies. Like we care about environmentalism, but we're pretty practical. And at the same time, I'm very patriotic, and where we can have a competitive advantage for Britain, let's do it.
Yeah. And, not to state the obvious, but certain other countries in Europe took a different path, right? And I think either explicitly or implicitly led themselves into quite a vulnerable position where they're very reliant on Russian gas, building renewables out, but arguably not in the right bits of Europe. Germany's not famous for its solar potential, should have started in Spain. But, Europe's struggling a little to align itself, where they've had this ideological opposition to nuclear, despite the fact that nuclear is the single biggest source of clean electrons in Europe still, because France demonstrated you could do that. I think the UK's pragmatism really showed there, where why would you switch off an asset in the middle of an energy crisis, which is producing clean electrons in a secure way? So, I think that pragmatism actually is probably a characteristic, isn't it, of the UK? But carrying on, so internationally then, you went to the COP as a minister, having gone to many COPs as not a minister. What was that like? And what were the biggest changes that you experienced?
I mean, every time I go to a COP, I usually think, oh, that's the last one ever. I did my first COP in 2005. I was at Friends of the Earth, and it was in Montreal, and Jennifer Morgan was running Cannes. Sadly, Jennifer Morgan's not running Cannes now, but she was at COP this time, and I met with her. So, some people
Well, she's been an environment minister in the meantime in Germany, right?
Exactly.
So, you've got a lot going on there.
Well, people change chairs, don't they, in terms of, but do you know what? So I went to the COP, and I'll be honest, I went with a bit of skepticism. I was worried about the global mood. We were going, it's a long way to get there from the UK. Was it going to be a successful event? I went in with a bit of skepticism. I came away really energized. And the reason I came away really energized was, I think, for a couple of issues. One is, like, the last couple have obviously been the last one I went to was in Egypt, but I know the last couple, they've been very closed spaces where no civil society has been allowed. It's been, and you almost felt that in the room. Certainly I did not enjoy it in Egypt at all. You didn't feel any sense of vibrancy, ideas, creativity. It almost felt like a corporate trade show. Whereas actually in the heart of the rainforest, the Brazilians obviously with all their vibrancy and life and everything else, with full of civil society, but full of a huge range of groups, meant that there was definitely more energy within the space. I also was really excited about British business, which I'd never expected. And actually, we did a meeting with all the Brits who were there, and the sort of sense I had was they were hungry. They were hungry to invest. So SSE did a massive announcement when they were there, around 33 billion on the grid. Huge announcements.
Scottish and Southern Energy, just a klaxon of the acronym there.
Sorry. One of our big energy companies did a big investment announcement in the grid, but we had people from the City of London, we had people from, different corporates who were there, and they were, it's a sense of this is happening, whatever goes on. And actually, the negotiations are one part of the COP. It has now moved that there are different elements of the COP, and negotiations are important in terms of setting a direction, but they are not what's practically happening in the world. And actually it allows a convening space for other people to get together and move stuff on. So I'm not saying it's where it all happens, but I personally came away, and also with the sense that, things that we've talked about for a long time, transition away from fossil fuels. Yes, it's too slow. Yes, we want to go further and faster. But we did get the vast majority of countries say, yes, we want to do that. We've got this roadmap. Now, obviously, where that goes is going to be, important. But there had been, a lot of countries did come together on forests. For ages, it's like, do not talk about nature, do not talk about forests. Forests were absolutely front and centre of that. And for the people who wanted, and there are some people in the world who wanted that whole process to fail, as an indicator of multilateralism failing, it didn't fail. Of course, we could say it wasn't gold-plated, et cetera, but it didn't fail.
Does that not just indicate that our bar is quite low, though? Because the non-failure was really just nothing really bad happened. But the truth of what the world is experiencing at the moment is still unmitigatingly higher greenhouse gases every year. And we've been doing this for 30 years, and we haven't bent the curve, yet.
So, no, I think if you look at Paris and where we were at Paris, and before we had the Paris Agreement, we were, 4 degrees, and now we're at 2.5 in terms of commitments. Obviously, we have to see, but in terms of, I think it is multilateralism is, I would continue to invest in that. Is it going to deliver everything? No. Of course, we've got to make sure that we work across nations, across different localities, across different regional groupings, across corporates. But it's definitely set some global rules that have been helpful. It provides a space to come together. And for some countries, we've talked about, the deployment, particularly we had a presentation from the IEA in China, is insane. It's just of a level. And I think some of the global agreement has created the framework. Now, there's other reasons why China has invested. You know very well about this in terms of, their own domestic economy, their own reliance. They saw it as an opportunity. They had domestic health issues, etc. And there are a lot of engineers.
It's a nation of engineers.
A nation of engineers. But at the same time, the multilateral system has had an impact on them.
It's a kind of double-edged sword, isn't it? Because if you think the international system is what's kind of driving this, at the moment you'd be quite pessimistic because the US has literally come in and smashed as much as it can of it. And yet that hasn't affected China's strategy or India's strategy, because in the real economy, they may show up at COP and argue about who's responsible and who should pay who, and there's all this stuff about finance, which is really small sums of money really compared to the real economy. But then they go back home and they carry on decarbonising because they're interested in, not being reliant on foreign oil. And so in a way, it kind of reassures me that the COPs are not the be all and end all, because if they were, US would have smashed it. But the US cannot smash the fact that China's now got a strategic advantage in electrifying its economy to get off oil. And so whatever happens in COPs, there's a kind of real economy now that's got its own momentum. And perhaps it was Paris, or perhaps it was even previous to Paris. It was probably tracks back to Germany saying solar is a really good thing that we could have a strategic advantage in, and then China going, hang on, we can do that better. So I guess that's the thing. They are, as you say, they can be sources of, can move the ball along in terms of people meeting, having bilateral conversations, a general sense of an idea exchange and feeling of momentum, and that creates a good narrative. But in the real economy, I think it's just now kind of irrelevant almost.
I don't think anything is the be all and end all of everything. Like, I don't think that, I think this is a hugely complex problem that we need multiple levers to solve. Do I think the international system and the structures are worth investing in multilateralism? Yes. And I would not, so I think I've always felt a bit more invested in it than perhaps you have, but I totally get the point that the real economy is thriving, and at which point does it become more impactful than not? Like, we could write essays on this, do you know what I mean, both of us, but I would continue to invest in it, as I say, and actually, because it is evolving into a different space, which is useful for different reasons, and useful for different collaborations, and useful, like, it was really interesting this year that there was loads of health people there. I never used to see anything on health. And I had this whole health community show up saying, and they were saying whether it was about infectious diseases, around lethal heat, around air quality, actually health is now on the agenda. And actually it's really interesting across Whitehall, Department of Health showing up at all the international climate meetings because it's starting to affect. So it definitely creates a forum for the different, elements to come forward. We've talked about this before. We've had, security is a big angle on this. So you can see some of those areas. But yeah, I mean, I'm probably a little bit more positive. But I hear your reservations.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way that I'm quite glad that it's not the only thing, right? As you said, there's many other factors that drive this. And because in terms of you saying some of the bilateral meetings are really inspiring. And one of the bilateral meetings, I've done a couple of meetings with the Ukrainians, and just as what the Ukrainians are doing in their country now, their shift, and obviously for energy security reasons primarily, they are shifting towards renewables, but the pace of which they're shifting is incredible. And you're like, and the context in which they're operating is obviously horrendous, but completely humbling. But also you're like, flipping heck, if they can do this in that context, what the heck is anybody else doing? What are we complaining about? So in that sense, there's a bit, you have interactions like that you think, I don't even know what to say. I am absolutely blown away when the Ukrainian ministers and the energy ministers come and tell the stories of what they have managed to achieve in the midst of a war. Hopefully that's an indication that Europe's still got this core strength of resilience, despite being under quite a lot of pressure, that is based on, we've also got a lot of engineers, right? We're not perhaps up there in terms of China's ability to direct the economy in certain directions, but a lot of our ingenuity and ideas are the things that then China commercializes. So we've definitely got some strengths we need to play into. And, maybe this is the era in which we get our act together and, by force of having to, because we're no longer able to rely on our friends across the Atlantic.
Well, and like on science, in terms of, I think one of the things, I've always been aware of, but being in the last few months, I've become more aware of is the value and how impressive British science is. We talked about Patrick Vallance, but in terms of, we have got some of the best climate scientists in the world. In the UK, and then you go in to see them within their settings and the spin-offs that are coming out. So I go on visits all the time and I love it, and I always find a story within the visit that I never thought I was going to find. And it's almost like now I set myself a challenge of who are you going to meet that's got a really good story. And quite often it's a spin-off business, innovation, idea that's come out of a climate, green, clean transition, whatever you want to call it, lab that's doing something and it spins out something else. So in Leeds, we were a CCS lab. They were obviously looking at CCS technology. And these guys, these young, cool guys, had found a different dye that would reduce the need of dye by 90%, but also, so much less inputs, massively less inputs, but also meant that you could pull out the dye so that the products can be recycled much more easily. But it was like, the quantities they were talking about was insane. I mean, they were like, it could revolutionize the dye industry, but it was nothing to do with CCS. But, you know, if you've got that creativity in science and investing in science and innovation, actually through climate, but whatever, is really helpful for us in terms of keeping ahead of the curve.
I agree. I think that's right. I think the problem we struggle with, I think, generally in Europe, is that ability to have the confidence to then allow an existing incumbent to be disrupted, right? And if you think of it going back to vehicles, because that's a big segment of the problem, we've got this fight now, you know, Europe deciding, oh, maybe we should slow down on the EV targets or pull back, just at the same time where China's moving even faster ahead. January the 1st this year, they introduced new efficiency standards for electric vehicles. Not, you know, they're moving so far ahead, so they're going to make electric vehicles more efficient and get more out for their electrons that are going in. Whereas we're like, oh, well, are we really not quite sure? Or are we ready? And it feels like the incumbency, the kind of drag down of, you know, you saw it, we see it all the time, that protectionism that we sometimes can create around existing jobs. I feel like there's got to be more bravery. Like, don't just settle for the strategy in the middle. You've got to sometimes commit. If you think the physics lines up, the economic lines up, and you can align incentives, don't do it by half measures. We haven't got time for half measures. I think you've got a lovely phrase for this. You know, don't just do the acceptable.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't want livable.
Yeah.
Look, I think you're getting to look, change is hard for people, and it changes even harder from a comfortable position, isn't it? So I think that does require leadership, and it does require listening. So I think there's a bit around saying, you know, you get people. And we started off with this conversation shouting up, saying, is this a problem? Is this a problem? And I think, to be honest, first of all, I do think we need to listen and figure out, because some of these problems will be real, and actually there'll be the friction points that we need to solve. Some of them are just fears. And I think it's listening to those fears, but also guiding people through it. So I agree with you. There is a risk that we don't take advantage of those opportunities, but that's down to us to lead and to explain what those benefits are, and to try and make sure we're, you know, managing any challenges along the way. But change is hard, and it's different for different personalities, isn't it? You know, I like change, but a lot of people don't like change, and it's how we do that. We've got a big change in terms of the North Sea. You know, obviously we're shifting towards a green economy, and so we introduced a thing in the budget which was is passporting around skills, which is a bit like what we do with the military. So when you come out of the military, you get a bespoke service. So it's end to end. It's you know, how to work with people, because actually a lot of the skills from the North Sea are things we're going to need geologically.
They've already transitioned a lot of them, right? The offshore industry wouldn't exist without the oil and gas industry underpinning it.
Yeah, exactly. So how do we make sure, but and as well, a lot of things have happened that we haven't told the story very well. And we, again, so as I said, Britain has done a really good job. And actually we're getting a huge amount of electricity from clean energy sources. Do people know that? Do people know that Britain's a leader in all of these things? I don't think they know enough, and I think we should feel pride in that, and that should give us the confidence to do more.
It is a success story, and the reduction in our reliance on fossil fuels, that, you know, we have got to get through this hump, because, as you say, we've taken out a big mortgage. We've had to put in a lot of capital to get to that, but it will pay dividends. And actually, you know, I think we talk about the North Sea. We're still producing, you know, a fair amount of our own energy, but we are going to have to plan for that diminishing reserve that we can't really magic back. You know, no matter what people might to think that we could start fracking the whole of the northeast and we'd get loads of gas. It just doesn't. Geography is dictating the fact that that's something we've got to move beyond. But we are so fortunate in our geography of wind that it absolutely makes sense. But I don't know that we've necessarily communicated it as well as we could. So
I agree. I agree. I think we've got a much bigger job to do in terms, but as you say, we are really lucky that our natural resources, fossil fuel, massive decline, but our natural windy resources, this windy little island, with so many, it is such potential for us. And actually, in terms as well, some of the coastal towns that you see can potential for, for having new jobs and investment within those areas is a real win-win if we can do that right.
Listen, I wanted to just do a little fast forward into like this year ahead, 26. It's already started off in a pretty high octane, chaotic way. What do you see, in the next year ahead, what next 100 days say, that's kind of top of the list for you? What are you currently working on?
We are in a volatile environment. Security is an issue. It is an issue, whether that's around energy security, whether it's around, food security, etc. And so I think in that context, the plan we are pursuing, which is having more energy independence around more clean energy, is the right one. But we need to explain that better. So I think it's around making it clear what that case is, what the risks are, but also what the opportunities are. We've talked about whether it's around British science, whether it's around British business, whether it's the fact that we've got a really windy isle, I've been out on visits and I've met with teenagers who are doing apprenticeships in clean, in installing clean energy. It's around making it clear what those opportunities are. And then thirdly, there is a lot of co-benefits that we sometimes, we talked a little bit about health, but whether it's around, nature restoration, a massive thing that people care about, or whether it's around those health benefits, there is a lot of co-benefits. That's a horrible phrase, but there is a lot of win-wins to doing this. But I think we've got to remake that case, and I think we've also got to listen to people. But it's not just about government making the case. Not many people listen to government, in terms of there are so many people across this country doing brilliant things. So I guess, and across the world, but obviously I'm focused primarily on Britain in terms of, how do we shine a light on those innovators, those entrepreneurs, those sort of community leaders who are doing this? And how do we learn from each other to ensure that we can move faster and multiply those ideas?
I'm just thinking of you then as a constituency MP as well. But also, I mean, the secret sauce to why we got the Climate Change Act, if we're honest, was, we came up with some pragmatic ideas, firstly. But secondly, we put the legwork in to selling the idea at a constituency level across the country, across all parties. And I'm wondering if you aren't perfectly positioned to try to take the story of climate change into constituency level conversations, because it has to land locally, doesn't it? And I imagine in this intake of new MPs, some of whom will be fully, up to speed on climate. A lot of them won't be. In fact, I've had a lot, when I was here active in Parliament, people would come up to me and go, what is net zero anyway? Like the basic level of understanding perhaps isn't there. Maybe there's a little bit of thing to take from that Friends of the Earth Day, those Friends of the Earth days, that we can do the abstract, we can do the international, but actually the putting the boots on the ground and going to constituencies and telling the story might be the way you shore up this transition and get the hearts involved. And I don't know whether
I think you've just signed me up to it. I mean, I have got flashbacks to those meetings that I used to. I think did I do 100 local meetings?
You did so many.
I've going around the country. Yeah, I think there's definitely, it's a good idea. I'm really willing to work with anybody. I am not. As I say, this is bigger than any party, any government. This is around our country, our future, and the future of our children. And I think you and I hold the same fear, but also the excitement. We have a lot of the right levers in place within this country to really leapfrog to the next level. So yeah, I mean, I will take it away as an idea.
Well, I think you talking about working with your strengths, right? As a country, we're doing that. We're leaning in on the offshore wind transition. We understand the future of the North Sea is shifting. We've got an amazing grid and fantastic companies that provide us with clean electrons. And we've got a nuclear expert. These are all solid things you can base it on. But for you personally, your strength, I think, is you've got an instinctive understanding of what the every man or every woman thinks and feels. You speak human, and you enjoy it. So, and you've got this energy as well, which is palpable. So I would put you on a roadshow tomorrow. But I'd also just encourage your colleagues in the you know, Labour MPs to reach out and have a chat with you, because that's the way you can sort of just be available. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because most ministers, even through the Conservative, they got briefings from civil servants that helped them understand. I don't think constituency MPs get that same access. And so anyway,
we'll definitely take it. And I think I do find it incredibly grounding, and it's sort of a breath of fresh air, literally, but going home and being in the constituency. And, you know, I'm really lucky to have the best constituency in the country. But, you know, I've got a lot of green space, but actually a lot of my constituents really care about this. And I ran on this ticket I ran on selection within the Labour Party members and said, look, this is what I care about. I mean, I also care about mental health and around business, but in terms of, I said climate and nature is the thing. And I think it's the way for us to, you know, to innovate, to create a new future for next generation. So I think it's a really positive vision for us. And so I ran on the ticket, and I was a bit nervous of like, would people, you know, but I was like, I've got to be honest. I've got to, you know, you get to an age where you're like, look, I am who I am. Do you know what I mean? And as you say, I've got an odd mix of being from a family of entrepreneurs, but being an environmentalist, you know, if I could travel, like if there was no carbon to travel, I love it. Do you know what I mean? And I think we've got to be honest that we are humans who have desires at the same time as wanting to respect our planetary boundaries. And how do we manage those tensions at all times? And actually for me, bringing the tensions together is where the magic happens.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, look, Katie, thank you so much for your time. It's really delightful to spend this time with you. And yeah, as you say, like people move seats and things change. And I'm so happy for you to be in this role, which you're clearly really loving. And I know you're going to make a great impact. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So that was Katie Wright, MP and Climate Minister. We'll put links in the show notes to any of the materials we referenced. And my thanks go to Oscar Boyd, our producer, to Jamie Oliver, our editor, to the Cleaning Up team and the Leadership Circle members who make this podcast possible. And thanks to you for listening. Please join us at the same time next week for another episode of Cleaning Up.
Cleaning Up is supported by its Leadership Circle. The members are Actis, Alcasa Energy, Arup, Signum Capital, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP, Euroelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. If you're enjoying Cleaning Up, please hit like, leave a comment, and also recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and absolutely everyone. To browse our archive of over 200 past episodes and subscribe to our free newsletter, visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live.